Hi everyone, it's Shari Carroll for SimonsStamp.com with a watercolor background using some Darkroom Door stamps. The stamps I'm starting off with are a couple sets. One is Fine Flowers and the other one is Watery Washes. And these sets come in a full sheet and they're really nice because you can cut them apart and keep them in the cases that they come in. If you've never cut out stamps before, I'll go ahead and show you how to do it. I use my Tim Holtz scissors because they are a Teflon and they also cut through really thick surfaces really well. So how I start off is I cut in just using straight cuts to kind of get in close to my stamp, but I don't do any fine detail cutting until I'm all done. Once I have that really well cut out, then I go back and I start to round corners and cut the smaller pieces. I'm ready to do some watercolor effects, and I wanted to show you that these stamps are gradated, so they kind of have a little bit of a surface to them, and it really holds the ink well. So I'm starting off with some Peacock Feathers Distress ink, and I'll be adding in a little bit of peeled paint to get a two-color effect. I'm just tapping on the ink, I'm sitting these colors next to each other, and I'm really not worried about contaminating. For the watercolor effect, I'm using my mister bottle from Ranger. I like this because it gives me a real fine mist. So I'll go ahead and spray that stamp until I can see the water kind of bubble up. If you want, with your misty tool or your acrylic block, you can go ahead and clean off some of the water that's around the stamp. That'll keep your work surface really clean. Since I'm using a cling stamp with my Misty, I've removed the foam that comes with it, and I'm using some Tim Holtz watercolor paper. So once I'm ready, I can go ahead and tilt that. That kind of mixes the colors together a little bit. And then I just gently press this right onto the paper and use my fingers to push that ink into the paper. I don't want to press really hard because it'll push it out around the sides and it'll distort the image. And once you're ready, you can go ahead and lift the Misty up and see what your colors have done. And I'm going to go ahead and let this run a little bit. So down in this lower area, I noticed that I didn't get enough water. And the beauty of using my Misty tool is I can go back and spray some more water onto the stamp. And I'll go ahead and wipe this up again just a little bit. And I can press this right back down and it will reactivate that ink that is on the paper and add a little bit more watercolor effect to the image. So now I have some really great color, and from there I can go ahead and just run this back and allow those drips to drip. To really capture the drips, you should use your heat tool to go ahead and set that ink in, otherwise everything will absorb into the paper. I had some lint on my paper and I allowed it to dry with that lint, and I just brush it off once it's completely dry. I'll show you how this looks up close. You can see the definition around the outside of the stamp and also the drip marks, and actually where the lint was, it looks kind of cool. So I'm going to go ahead and add some more color to this panel. So I'll replace my little broken magnets into my Misty. And now I have a different Watery Washes stamp, and I'm going to go ahead and place that into my Misty. And I've inked this one up with Cracked Pistachio and Carved Pumpkin Distress inks. And after I've misted it, I run my finger into it just a little bit to kind of mix those colors together. And once I'm ready, I can go ahead and press this down onto that panel. And this will give me a double color where my first original image is, and now the second image. So I'm letting that set into the paper a little bit, and I'll go ahead and lift that off. And before I set that color with my heat tool, I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of those drips and move them around a little bit. And once I'm happy with how the ink looks, I can go ahead and use my heat tool to set it in. I'm adding in a third image, and for this one I've used ripe persimmon and mustard seed, and I've done the same process of adding the water. And I'm going to let that drip sit in there because I think it's really a great looking drip. So I'll go ahead and clean that stamp off with my towel. And I can go ahead and lift up my paper and again use my heat tool to set the color in. Now I'm using a smaller stamp and it has little tiny splots of what you would use for color, but instead of using an ink on it, I'm using my water and I'm drying that off around there again, and now I'm pressing it onto what I've already inked or already stamped and pressing that in really well, and I'll be removing color this time. So I'm letting that water set in just a bit. And next I'll go ahead and blot it up with a paper towel. This technique fades out the strong color and also adds a little bit of texture. So again, I'll be using my water, and I'm going up into another strong area of ink, pressing that down. And I like to let that set just for a second, and then once I've opened up my MISTI, I can go ahead and use my paper towel to remove more color. And next I'm going to stamp a daisy image over the top of the entire panel, and I'll be using my Versamark ink. I have let my panel completely dry. You can use your heat tool or your heat gun. Just make sure it's completely dry. So I'm going to ink this up really well with my Versamark ink. And before I stamp this onto the panel, I'm going to use my anti-static bag just to make sure that I don't let any of that extra embossing powder stick to that background. So I'm going to really make sure I cover that well. I'll be doing some embossing in white so that it'll really pop. So once I'm ready, make sure everything is lined up, I'll go ahead and press that stamp right into the paper. And then I can sprinkle it with my white embossing powder and tap off the excess. I always like to give it a good inspection first, just to make sure I have everything covered, and go back over and add more if I need to. And finally, I can heat set the embossing powder with my heat tool. Here's a close-up of the embossed flower. It really shows a lot of the fine detail and all the mixing of the colors. To finish the card off, I've trimmed down my panel and I've mounted that to some slate cardstock. Then I added some black twine and tied that in a bow, and then mounted that panel to a fog card. I hope I've given you some inspiration on how to create a watercolor background using some Darkroom Door stamps. And as always, thanks for watching.